In the shadowed corridors of power where ambition meets opportunity, there exists a weapon more formidable than any blade, more penetrating than any rhetoric, and more enduring than any alliance. This weapon requires no forge, no training, no wealth to acquire, yet it remains the most difficult for mortals to master. It is silence, wielded not as weakness or absence, but as a deliberate and calculated force that shapes the very foundations upon which respect and fear are built. The great Florentine, Niccolò Machiavelli, understood this principle with crystalline clarity. In his observations of princes, merchants, and common folk alike, he witnessed how those who spoke least often held the greatest sway over the hearts and minds of others. Yet this was not the silence of the meek or the intimidated, this was the silence of the strategist, the calculated pause of one who understands that words, once released, can never be recalled, while silence can be broken at the precise moment of maximum advantage. Consider the merchant Prince Lorenzo, who rose from modest beginnings in the textile quarters of Florence to command the respect of kings and cardinals. His ascension began not with grand proclamations or bold statements of intent, but with a profound understanding that in a world where every man sought to be heard, the one who listened held the true advantage. While his competitors boasted of their connections, their wealth, their grand plans for expansion, Lorenzo remained silent at the guild meetings, his dark eyes moving from speaker to speaker, absorbing not merely their words but the spaces between them, the hesitations that revealed uncertainty, the overstatements that masked weakness, the alliances that were proclaimed too loudly to be genuine. In those early years, when Lorenzo was still learning the intricate dance of commerce and politics, he observed an incident that would shape his understanding of power forever. A prominent silk merchant, Francesco, had been caught manipulating weights to cheat his customers. The guild convened to determine his fate, and every member was expected to speak their judgment. One by one, they rose to condemn Francesco, each trying to outdo the previous speaker in moral indignation, each seeking to distance themselves from the scandal by the volume and passion of their denunciation. When Lorenzo's turn came, he remained seated. The hall grew quiet, waiting for his words. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Members began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The guild master called his name again. Still, Lorenzo remained silent, his gaze fixed not on Francesco, but on each member of the assembly in turn. In that silence, something profound occurred. The assembled merchants began to wonder what Lorenzo knew that they did not. Did he possess information that would change everything? Was his silence judgment enough? Or was he calculating something that their hasty words had prevented them from seeing? Finally, after what seemed an eternity, Lorenzo stood. He did not speak of Francesco's crime that had been thoroughly documented by others. Instead, he spoke a single sentence: a man's reputation is built over years and destroyed in moments, but the market's memory determines which lessons we choose to remember. With that, he sat down. Francesco was expelled from the guild, as had been foregone conclusion, but it was Lorenzo's measured response that people discussed in the taverns that night. His silence had created a space for wisdom that the others' eager condemnations had not. This incident revealed to Lorenzo the first principle of strategic silence, that in a world saturated with noise, the absence of sound draws attention more powerfully than its presence. When everyone else is speaking, the silent one becomes the focal point of curiosity and speculation. This attention, properly managed, becomes a form of power that cannot be directly challenged because it cannot be directly confronted. But Lorenzo's understanding went deeper than mere attention-seeking. He recognized that silence serves as a mirror for the fears and expectations of others. When he remained quiet during subsequent business negotiations, potential partners projected onto his silence their own anxieties about what he might know or what he might be planning. A competitor who had been confident in his position suddenly began to question whether Lorenzo possessed information that would undermine his advantage. A potential ally wondered whether Lorenzo's silence indicated approval or disapproval, and began making concessions to earn a response that might never come. The psychological mechanism at work here is ancient and primal. Human beings are creatures of language and communication, and we instinctively seek to fill voids in conversation. When faced with sustained silence from someone we perceive as significant, we begin to create narratives to explain that silence. These narratives are inevitably colored by our own fears, desires, and insecurities. The silent person becomes a blank canvas upon which others paint their own psychological landscapes, and, in doing so, they reveal far more about themselves than they intended. Lorenzo learned to read these revelations with the skill of a scholar interpreting ancient texts. A merchant's nervous laughter in the face of Lorenzo's silence revealed uncertainty about his financial position. A competitor's rush to fill the quiet with additional offers showed desperation rather than strength. A potential ally's discomfort with extended pauses indicated a weak negotiating position or hidden agenda. As Lorenzo's reputation grew, so did the effectiveness of his silence. People began to approach conversations with him already influenced by stories of his calculating quiet. They entered negotiations expecting measured pauses and pregnant silences, which only increased their tendency to project meaning onto his lack of words. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where Lorenzo's reputation for strategic silence made his actual silence more powerful, which in turn enhanced his reputation. The transformation was remarkable. Within a decade, Lorenzo had evolved from a minor player in the textile trade to a central figure in Florentine commerce. Princes sought his counsel, though he rarely offered it directly. Cardinals valued his opinion, though he seldom voiced it unsolicited. His fellow merchants both feared and respected him, though they could rarely point to specific actions that justified these feelings. The key to Lorenzo's success lay not in any supernatural wisdom or extraordinary intelligence, but in his understanding of a fundamental truth about human nature: people respect most what they understand least, and fear most what they cannot predict. By maintaining strategic silence, Lorenzo created an aura of mystery that others interpreted as depth. His reluctance to commit to definitive statements was perceived as careful consideration rather than uncertainty. His pauses were seen as thoughtfulness rather than hesitation. This perception was not entirely false. Lorenzo had indeed become more thoughtful and careful in his approach to business and relationships. The practice of strategic silence had forced him to become a better listener, a more careful observer, and a more deliberate thinker. When he did speak, his words carried weight precisely because they were rare and measured. He had learned to edit his thoughts before voicing them, to consider multiple perspectives before committing to any position, and to recognize that the most powerful communication often happens in the spaces between words. But Lorenzo's silence was never passive or empty. It was an active choice, a strategic tool employed with specific goals in mind. He understood the difference between the silence of ignorance and the silence of knowledge, between the quiet of weakness and the quiet of strength. His silence was pregnant with possibility, charged with potential energy that could be directed toward specific outcomes when the moment was right. The respect that Lorenzo earned through his strategic use of silence was qualitatively different from the respect accorded to those who gained prominence through wealth, family connections, or political maneuvering. These traditional sources of power were external and could be lost through circumstances beyond one's control. But the respect born of mysterious competence, of calculated restraint, of wisdom suggested rather than demonstrated, this respect was more durable because it was based on perception rather than tangible assets. Fear, too, played its role in Lorenzo's ascension, though not the crude fear of physical violence or economic retaliation that lesser men employed. The fear that Lorenzo inspired was more subtle and, perhaps more effective. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of being at a disadvantage in negotiations with someone whose thoughts and intentions remained opaque, the fear of underestimating an opponent whose capabilities were matters of speculation rather than clear observation. This fear was not born of any cruel or aggressive actions on Lorenzo's part. Indeed, he was known for his fairness in business dealings and his reliability in honoring agreements. The fear arose instead from uncertainty about what he was thinking, what he knew, what he was planning. This uncertainty made people more careful in their dealings with him, more generous in their offers, more honest in their representations. They feared not what he might do to them, but what advantages they might be conceding through their own ignorance of his position. The combination of respect and fear that Lorenzo commanded through strategic silence created a unique form of social power. Unlike the authority of kings or the influence of wealth, this power required constant renewal and careful maintenance. It demanded that Lorenzo continue to justify the mysterious competence that others attributed to him. It required him to be genuinely thoughtful and strategic, because the silence would eventually be broken, and, when it was, his words and actions had to live up to the expectations his quiet demeanor had created. This created a paradox that Machiavelli would have appreciated. Lorenzo's strategic silence forced him to become the kind of person others imagined him to be. The respect and fear generated by his calculated reticence required him to develop the wisdom and strategic thinking that others projected onto his quiet confidence. In a sense, his silence became a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating the very qualities it was initially meant to suggest. The implications of Lorenzo's example extend far beyond the merchant guilds of Renaissance Florence. The principles he discovered through practice are universal aspects of human psychology that remain relevant across cultures and centuries. The human tendency to fill conversational voids with projection, to respect what we cannot fully understand, and to fear what we cannot predict, these are constants of social interaction that the strategically minded can learn to employ. Yet the wielding of silence as a tool of influence requires careful calibration. Silence employed too frequently becomes predictable and loses its power. Silence maintained too rigidly becomes alienating rather than intriguing. The art lies in knowing when to speak and when to remain quiet, when to reveal and when to conceal, when to provide clarity and when to maintain productive ambiguity. Lorenzo mastered this balance through years of careful observation and practiced restraint. He developed an intuitive sense for the rhythm of conversation, the psychology of his interlocutors, and the strategic value of information. He learned to distinguish between silence that served his purposes and silence that merely served his ego, between mystery that enhanced his influence and obscurity that isolated him from useful intelligence. The Merchant Prince's success illuminated the first great truth of Machiavellian silence, that in a world where everyone seeks to be heard, the power to remain strategically quiet is a rare and valuable skill. It requires discipline, wisdom, and a deep understanding of human nature. But, for those who master it, silence becomes not an absence of communication, but a more sophisticated form of it, one that allows others to reveal themselves while concealing one's own intentions until the moment is right for revelation. Part 2. The Architecture of Fear through Calculated Restraint. The transition from respected merchant to figure of subtle influence required Lorenzo to understand a more complex dynamic, how strategic silence could be weaponized not merely to gain respect, but to inspire a particular kind of fear that enhanced rather than destroyed relationships. This was not the blunt instrument of intimidation that lesser men employed, but something far more sophisticated, the fear of consequences that remained unspecified, of knowledge that remained unshared, of capabilities that remained undemonstrated. Cardinal Raphael Riario, nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, first encountered Lorenzo during negotiations over a substantial loan that the Church required for its expanding territorial ambitions. The cardinal had grown accustomed to dealing with merchants who either groveled obsequiously for ecclesiastical favor or attempted to overcompensate for their inferior social station through elaborate displays of wealth and erudition. Lorenzo did neither. When Riario entered the meeting chamber accompanied by his usual retinue of advisors and secretaries, he found Lorenzo already present, seated alone at the massive oak table, examining a document with the casual attention one might give to a routine inventory. No greeting was offered beyond a slight nod of acknowledgement. No deference was displayed, but neither was there any hint of disrespect. Lorenzo simply continued reading until the cardinal and his party had settled themselves, then placed the document aside and regarded Riario with patient attention, as if waiting for the cardinal to explain why this meeting had been called. The absence of the expected social choreography created an immediate tension. Riario found himself uncertain how to begin. His usual opening gambit, graciously acknowledging the honor that a merchant might feel at meeting with a prince of the church, seemed suddenly inappropriate. Lorenzo's demeanor suggested neither honor nor anxiety, merely professional readiness to discuss whatever business had brought them together. "We have need of financial accommodation," Riario began, then paused, expecting some response, perhaps eager questions about the amount required, the terms of repayment, the security being offered. Instead, Lorenzo nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and continued to wait. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone present except Lorenzo himself, who seemed as patient as stone. Riario continued, outlining the church's requirements, the urgency of the need, the potential for future business relationships. Lorenzo listened without interruption, without questions, without any visible reaction that might indicate his thoughts about the proposal. When the cardinal finished his presentation, another silence ensued. Riario's advisors shifted in their seats, uncertain whether more explanation was needed or whether Lorenzo was somehow signaling dissatisfaction with the terms. Finally, Lorenzo spoke, "When do you require an answer?" The simplicity of the question was somehow more unsettling than a complex negotiation would have been.
It suggested that Lorenzo's decision process involved factors that had not been discussed, considerations that Riario had not anticipated.
The cardinal had expected to engage in the familiar dance of negotiation, offers and counteroffers, discussions of terms, perhaps some degree of persuasion or inducement. Instead, he found himself in the position of a supplicant awaiting judgment from someone who had revealed nothing of his criteria for making such judgments. "The matter is somewhat urgent," Riario replied, hating the uncertainty he heard in his own voice. "Tomorrow, then," Lorenzo said, and stood to leave. The brevity of the meeting left Riario and his advisors in a state of profound discomfort. They had come prepared for extended negotiations and found themselves dismissed after what felt like a preliminary consultation. More troubling was their complete inability to gauge Lorenzo's inclinations. Was he favorably disposed toward the loan? Had they offered acceptable terms? Did he require additional incentives or guarantees? The merchant's silence had provided no clues. That evening, Riario's advisors offered contradictory interpretations of Lorenzo's behavior. Some suggested his brevity indicated confidence in his ability to fulfill the church's requirements. Others worried that his lack of questions suggested disinterest or even disdain for the proposal. Still others speculated that his reserved manner indicated he was calculating how much additional profit he might extract from the church's evident urgency. The cardinal found himself experiencing something he rarely felt when dealing with merchants: uncertainty about the balance of power in the relationship. Usually, the church's spiritual authority and political influence created an automatic advantage in financial negotiations. Merchants might drive hard bargains, but they did so from a position of acknowledged inferiority. Lorenzo, however, had managed to create the impression that he was conferring a favor by even considering the church's request, despite the fact that the loan would obviously benefit him financially. When Lorenzo returned the following day, he brought with him a single sheet of parchment containing his terms. The amount of the loan was exactly what the church had requested. The interest rate was fair, neither generous nor usurious. The security requirements were reasonable. Yet somehow, the very straightforwardness of the proposal was intimidating. There were no requests for additional considerations, no attempts to leverage the church's need for political advantage, no obvious efforts to extract maximum profit from the situation. This restraint was more unsettling than aggressive negotiation would have been, because it suggested resources and confidence that remained hidden. A merchant who drove a hard bargain was predictable, his motivations were transparent and his limitations could be estimated. But a merchant who offered fair terms while maintaining complete opacity about his thinking process, such a merchant might possess advantages that had not yet been revealed. "These terms are acceptable," Riario said, after reviewing the proposal. Lorenzo nodded and produced a standard loan agreement already prepared with the terms he had specified. The cardinal's secretary began to review the document for potential complications or hidden provisions, but found none. The language was clear, the terms were exactly as discussed, the legal structure was entirely conventional. Yet this transparency, coming from someone who had been so opaque in his personal presentation, seemed somehow ominous. "You were confident of our acceptance," Riario observed. "I was confident of offering terms you could accept," Lorenzo replied. The distinction was subtle but significant. Lorenzo was not claiming to have predicted the cardinal's decision, but rather suggesting that he understood the church's position well enough to craft an offer that would be difficult to refuse. This implied a level of strategic thinking and information that exceeded what had been revealed during their initial meeting. As their business relationship developed over subsequent months, Riario found himself increasingly aware of Lorenzo's capacity for this kind of calculated restraint. The merchant never pressed for information about church affairs, but somehow always seemed aware of political developments that might affect his interests. He never explicitly threatened consequences for late payments or changes in terms, but the possibility of such consequences seemed to hover in the background of their interactions. This ambient sense of unspecified capability became a form of protection for Lorenzo's interests that was more effective than legal remedies or political pressure might have been. Riario found himself being more careful about honoring agreements precisely because he was uncertain what resources Lorenzo might bring to bear if those agreements were violated. The cardinal had dealt with many merchants who had threatened legal action, political retaliation, or economic sanctions for non-payment. Such threats were manageable because they were explicit, their scope and limitations could be assessed, and appropriate countermeasures could be developed.
But Lorenzo never made threats, explicit or implicit.
His silence on the subject of enforcement left Riario to imagine what form such enforcement might take, and the imagination proved far more constraining than any specific warning could have been. The cardinal found himself wondering about Lorenzo's other business relationships, his political connections, his sources of information about church affairs. These wonderings led to a general caution in dealing with the merchant that served Lorenzo's interests more effectively than any confrontational approach could have achieved. The dynamic that developed between Lorenzo and Cardinal Riario illustrates the second principle of strategic silence, that the fear inspired by unknown capabilities is often more powerful than the fear of known threats. When someone understands exactly what you are capable of doing to them, they can calculate the costs and benefits of various courses of action and choose their response accordingly. But, when your capabilities remain mysterious, they must assume the worst-case scenario in their planning, which generally leads to more cautious and accommodating behavior. Lorenzo's silence about his resources, connections, and potential responses to various contingencies created what military strategists call strategic ambiguity, a situation where potential adversaries must prepare for multiple possible scenarios because they cannot determine which one is most likely. This ambiguity forced those who dealt with Lorenzo to be more careful, more honest, and more accommodating than they might have been if his position had been clearly defined. The effectiveness of this approach became apparent when other merchants began to emulate Lorenzo's style. Francesco Pazzi, a competitor in the banking sector, attempted to adopt Lorenzo's practice of strategic silence in his own negotiations. However, Pazzi's efforts were transparently imitative rather than genuinely strategic. He would remain silent at inappropriate moments, creating awkwardness rather than mystery. He would refuse to answer direct questions that required straightforward responses, causing confusion rather than respect. His silence felt artificial and calculated in an obvious way that undermined rather than enhanced his authority. The difference between Lorenzo's effective use of strategic silence and Pazzi's failed imitation highlighted the complexity of this approach to influence. Silence could not be employed as a simple technique or trick. It required genuine strategic thinking, authentic confidence, and a deep understanding of the psychology of the people with whom one was dealing. Lorenzo's silence was effective because it reflected real depth of consideration and actual strategic capability. When he remained quiet, it was because he was genuinely processing information, calculating options, or waiting for additional data that would improve his position. Pazzi's silence, by contrast, was empty performance. Because he lacked Lorenzo's strategic depth, his attempts to create mystery only revealed his superficiality. His pauses felt awkward because they were not filled with genuine consideration but with desperate attempts to appear more thoughtful than he actually was. His reluctance to commit to positions stemmed not from strategic calculation but from uncertainty and fear of making mistakes. The contrast between the two men's approaches revealed the third principle of strategic silence, that the power of unspoken communication depends entirely on the quality of thought that underlies it. Silence without substance is quickly exposed as empty theatrics. But silence that emerges from genuine strategic consideration, from real depth of analysis, from actual capability, such silence carries an authority that can be felt even when its source remains hidden. Lorenzo's success in inspiring productive fear through strategic restraint also depended on his careful attention to the difference between intimidation and influence. Intimidation relies on the explicit or implicit threat of harm. It creates compliance through fear of specific negative consequences. Influence, on the other hand, creates voluntary cooperation by making such cooperation appear to be in the other party's own interest. The fear that Lorenzo inspired was not fear of what he might do to those who opposed him, but fear of what advantages they might lose by failing to maintain good relationships with him. Cardinal Riario was not concerned that Lorenzo would harm the church if their business relationship soured. He was concerned that he might lose access to the most reliable and strategically minded financier in Florence. The distinction was crucial because it meant that people were drawn to Lorenzo rather than driven away from him by the uncertainty he created. This required Lorenzo to demonstrate, through his actions over time, that relationships with him were genuinely beneficial to his partners. His strategic silence could not be maintained indefinitely without substantive performance to back it up. The respect and productive fear he generated through mystery had to be validated through competence, reliability, and mutual advantage. The validation came through Lorenzo's consistent delivery of exactly what he promised, when he promised it, at the terms he specified. His lending was profitable but fair. His information was accurate and valuable. His discretion was absolute. His analysis, when finally shared, was invariably thoughtful and useful. Over time, people learned that Lorenzo's silence preceded wisdom, that his restraint preceded competence, that his mystery concealed capabilities rather than weaknesses. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where Lorenzo's reputation for strategic depth made his silence more powerful, which in turn required him to maintain the level of strategic thinking that would justify the respect his silence commanded. The fear he inspired was ultimately fear of missing opportunities, fear of making decisions without access to his analysis, fear of operating without the advantages that his partnership could provide. The sophistication of this approach to influence became evident when Lorenzo began to be consulted not just for financial services but for strategic advice on matters far removed from commerce. Cardinal Riario found himself seeking Lorenzo's thoughts on political developments, territorial disputes, even matters of church policy that had no direct bearing on their business relationship. These consultations followed a familiar pattern. Riario would present a situation or dilemma, often framing it in hypothetical terms to avoid compromising church secrets. Lorenzo would listen without interruption, ask a few precise questions, then lapse into thoughtful silence. When he finally responded, his analysis would be brief but penetrating, often revealing aspects of the situation that Riario had not previously considered. The cardinal came to value these discussions not just for the insights they provided, but for the quality of thinking they represented. Lorenzo's strategic silence had forced him to become a better analyst, a more careful observer, a more systematic thinker. The respect and fear his mystery inspired required him to possess the wisdom that others attributed to his quiet confidence. This transformation illustrates the ultimate paradox of strategic silence as a tool of influence, that its effective use requires the practitioner to develop genuine strategic capability. Unlike other forms of manipulation, which can be employed successfully by those who lack the qualities they pretend to possess, strategic silence eventually demands authentic depth. The silence creates space for projection and speculation, but that space must eventually be filled with substance if the influence is to be maintained. Lorenzo had discovered that the most sustainable form of power was that which required its wielder to become worthy of it. His strategic silence had made him not just more influential, but more genuinely strategic, more thoughtful, more wise. The fear and respect he commanded through calculated restraint were ultimately justified by the qualities that such restraint had forced him to develop. Part 3, The Mastery of Respect Through Deliberate Concealment. The culmination of Lorenzo's understanding came not through any single dramatic revelation, but through the gradual recognition that the highest form of influence arose when fear and respect converged into something approaching reverence, a state where others sought not merely to avoid his displeasure or gain his favor, but to understand his methods and, perhaps, glimpse the strategic mind that operated behind his carefully maintained silence. By his 50th year, Lorenzo had become what the Florentines called il silenzioso, the silent one, a designation that carried none of the negative connotations such a title might suggest. His silence was no longer remarkable for its novelty but for its consistency and the results it produced. Young merchants would observe him during guild meetings, studying his posture, his expressions, the timing of his rare interventions, hoping to decode the source of his influence. Cardinals and secular princes had learned to factor his unstated opinions into their political calculations, knowing that his eventual position on matters of importance would likely prove prescient. The transformation of silence from technique to reputation, from strategy to identity, revealed the fourth and most sophisticated principle of Machiavellian influence, that true mastery occurs when one's methods become inseparable from one's character, when the strategic employment of restraint evolves into authentic wisdom, when the respect initially commanded through mystery becomes justified through demonstrated capability. This evolution was tested most severely during the crisis that historians would later call the War of the Eight Saints, when Florence found itself in conflict with the Papal States over territorial and commercial disputes. The war created a situation where traditional loyalties and business relationships became dangerous complications, where merchants with significant church connections faced impossible choices between civic duty and financial survival. Lorenzo's position was particularly precarious. His extensive loans to various church entities made him vulnerable to economic retaliation, while his prominence in Florentine commerce made him a natural target for pressure from the city's political leadership. Both sides expected him to declare his allegiances, to use his influence and resources in support of their cause, to speak clearly about where his interests lay in the unfolding conflict.
Instead, Lorenzo became even more silent than usual.
He attended guild meetings but offered no opinions on the war or its implications for Florentine commerce. He continued to honor his existing obligations to church borrowers while making no new loans. He maintained his normal business practices while carefully avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as taking sides in the broader conflict. This studied neutrality was interpreted differently by different observers, each group projecting onto his silence the meanings that served their own psychological needs. Florentine patriots saw his continued presence in the city as evidence of loyalty to the Republic, while his obvious restraint in exploiting church difficulties demonstrated wisdom rather than divided loyalties. Church officials interpreted his continued honor of existing agreements as evidence that his fundamental sympathies lay with them, while his refusal to provide new financing was understood as prudent caution rather than hostility. The genius of Lorenzo's approach lay not in playing both sides for advantage, but in recognizing that the conflict itself was temporary while the relationships and reputation he had built were permanent assets that should not be sacrificed for short-term political gains. His silence during this period was not empty neutrality but strategic patience, a willingness to absorb temporary pressure rather than take actions that would limit his future options. This patience was tested when both sides began to apply direct pressure. The Florentine authorities suggested that his continued business relationships with church entities demonstrated insufficient patriotism. Church officials hinted that his failure to provide additional financing during their time of need revealed the limitations of his loyalty. Both sides made it clear that they expected more definitive support and that continued neutrality might be interpreted as opposition. Lorenzo's response to these pressures revealed the full sophistication of his strategic approach. Rather than defending his position through argument or explanation, he allowed his past actions to speak for him while maintaining absolute silence about his future intentions. When questioned about his loyalty to Florence, he simply referenced his decades of service to the guild and his consistent residence in the city during times of both prosperity and difficulty. When pressed about his relationship with the church, he pointed to his scrupulous fulfillment of all contracted obligations despite the obvious risks such fulfillment entailed. This approach transformed pressure into validation of his character. By refusing to engage in defensive explanations, Lorenzo forced both sides to evaluate his position based on his demonstrated behavior rather than his stated intentions. His silence compelled others to make the case for his reliability rather than allowing them to demand additional proof of his loyalty. The effectiveness of this strategy became apparent as the war progressed and both sides found themselves needing Lorenzo's services despite his refusal to declare unambiguous support for their cause. His financial resources remained significant, his strategic judgment was still valued, and his network of relationships continued to be useful. More importantly, his refusal to compromise his long-term relationships for short-term political advantage demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made his counsel valuable. The Florentine leadership began to appreciate that Lorenzo's restraint during the crisis was not evidence of divided loyalties but proof of the strategic discipline that made him an invaluable asset to the Republic. His unwillingness to sacrifice future capabilities for present advantages showed exactly the kind of long-term thinking that successful statecraft required. Similarly, church officials recognized that a partner who honored his obligations even during times of conflict was more valuable than one who provided enthusiastic but potentially unreliable support. Lorenzo's navigation of this crisis illuminated the fifth principle of strategic silence, that the highest form of influence is achieved when one's restraint is perceived not as weakness or indecision, but as evidence of superior strategic thinking. This perception cannot be created through explanation or argument, it must emerge from the demonstrated results of such thinking over time. The war's resolution validated Lorenzo's approach. When peace was eventually negotiated, he found his relationships with both sides not merely intact but enhanced. His financial position had been preserved, his reputation for strategic wisdom had been confirmed, and his network of influence had actually expanded as both sides sought to maintain good relationships with someone who had proven his worth without requiring exclusive loyalty. More significantly, Lorenzo's handling of the crisis had demonstrated to the broader community the practical value of his approach to influence. Other merchants began to study his methods not as curiosities but as practical techniques for navigating complex political and commercial environments. His strategic silence was no longer seen as an idiosyncratic personality trait but as a replicable approach to building sustainable influence. This recognition led to requests for Lorenzo to share his understanding with others, to explain his methods, to teach his techniques, to make explicit the strategic thinking that his silence had concealed. These requests created a delicate challenge: how to respond to demands for revelation without undermining the mystery that was central to his influence, how to educate others without diluting the scarcity that made his approach valuable.
Lorenzo's solution demonstrated the final evolution of his strategic thinking.
Rather than revealing his methods explicitly, he began to demonstrate them through carefully chosen examples and analogies. When young merchants asked how they might develop similar influence, he would tell stories, sometimes from his own experience, sometimes from history, sometimes entirely fictional, that illustrated the principles without making them explicitly didactic. These stories served multiple purposes. They satisfied the desire for instruction while maintaining the sense of mystery that was central to Lorenzo's reputation. They allowed him to share his understanding without claiming ownership of universal principles that others could simply copy and apply. Most importantly, they forced his students to think strategically about the examples he provided rather than simply memorizing techniques they could attempt to duplicate. One such story concerned a fictional merchant named Marco who had built influence through systematic observation rather than active networking. Marco would attend market gatherings not to promote his own goods but to listen to conversations, to note which traders seemed anxious about their inventory levels, which buyers appeared to be searching for specific items, which negotiations seemed to be stalled over particular terms. This information allowed Marco to serve as an informal intermediary, suggesting connections and solutions without claiming credit for the successful transactions that resulted. The story continued through various episodes that demonstrated how Marco's reputation for useful knowledge attracted people to seek his informal counsel, how his refusal to accept direct payment for such counsel created obligations that proved more valuable than fees, how his systematic discretion about confidential information made people more willing to share sensitive details that enhanced his understanding of market conditions. Lorenzo would tell this story without explicitly connecting it to his own methods, but the parallels were obvious to thoughtful listeners. The story demonstrated the power of listening over speaking, the value of information over immediate profit, the importance of building long-term relationships rather than seeking short-term advantages. More importantly, it showed how strategic restraint could create sustainable influence by making oneself valuable to others rather than threatening to them. Another story involved a counselor to princes who gained influence by asking questions rather than providing answers. This counselor would listen to problems or dilemmas, then ask carefully crafted questions that helped the prince clarify his own thinking rather than imposing external solutions. Over time, princes came to value these sessions because they led to better decisions, while the counselor gained influence by helping rulers discover their own wisdom rather than creating dependence on external advice. These stories served as encrypted instruction in Lorenzo's methods while preserving the mystery that made those methods effective. Students could decode the principles being illustrated, but they could not simply copy the techniques without developing the underlying understanding that made such techniques work. The stories required interpretation, analysis, and application rather than mere imitation. The success of this indirect teaching approach revealed the final principle of strategic silence, that true mastery involves not just the effective use of influence, but the ability to perpetuate effective approaches without diluting their power. Lorenzo had discovered how to share his understanding while maintaining its scarcity, how to educate others while preserving the uniqueness that made education valuable. This balance between revelation and concealment became Lorenzo's ultimate achievement. He had evolved from a merchant who used silence as a tactical advantage to a figure who embodied the strategic principles that made such tactics effective. His influence was no longer dependent on mystery alone but on the demonstrated wisdom that mystery had originally been employed to suggest. In his later years, Lorenzo's reputation transcended the specific contexts in which it had been built. Diplomats sought his advice on negotiations with foreign powers. Scholars consulted him about political theory and practical statecraft. Even artists and architects valued his perspective on projects that had no obvious connection to commerce or politics. This broad respect reflected the complete integration of Lorenzo's strategic thinking with his personal identity. His silence was no longer a technique he employed but an authentic expression of his approach to understanding and influencing the world. His restraint was not calculated performance but genuine wisdom about when communication served useful purposes and when it merely satisfied ego or social expectations.
The transformation was complete. Lorenzo had become the kind of person his strategic silence had originally been designed to suggest he might be. The respect and fear he had initially commanded through mystery were now justified by authentic capability.
The influence he had built through calculated restraint was sustained by genuine strategic wisdom. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lorenzo's evolution was his understanding that the ultimate purpose of influence was not to accumulate power for its own sake, but to create space for thoughtful action in a world dominated by hasty speech and reactive behavior. His strategic silence had not merely made him more influential, it had made him more thoughtful, more observant, more capable of seeing patterns and possibilities that escaped those who were too busy talking to listen or too eager to act to think. In the end, Lorenzo's mastery of strategic silence had taught him that the greatest victory was not defeating others but transcending the need for conflict, not commanding fear but inspiring genuine respect, not accumulating influence but using whatever influence one possessed in service of wisdom rather than ego. His silence had become a form of leadership that led by example rather than command, that influenced through attraction rather than pressure, that achieved lasting results through patient cultivation rather than dramatic intervention. The merchant prince had discovered the ultimate Machiavellian truth, that the most sustainable power is that which makes its wielder worthy of respect rather than merely capable of demanding it, that the most effective influence is that which serves wisdom rather than merely advancing personal advantage, and that the most lasting silence is that which emerges not from calculation but from the depth of understanding that makes unnecessary speech as rare as it is valuable. This understanding would outlive Lorenzo himself, passed down not through explicit instruction but through the example of a life that demonstrated the practical value of strategic restraint, the sustainable power of earned respect, and the quiet influence of authentic wisdom applied consistently over time. His legacy would be found not in any particular achievement or acquisition, but in the transformation of silence from empty space into fertile ground for the cultivation of judgment, understanding, and practical wisdom that could be applied across all domains of human endeavor. The Machiavellian art of strategic silence, as embodied in Lorenzo's life and demonstrated through his example, revealed itself ultimately as a discipline of character rather than a technique of manipulation, a practice of wisdom rather than a tool of advantage, a way of being in the world that honored both the complexity of human relationships and the practical requirements of effective action within that complexity.